Here's the focus question for you. So a new one hasn't been asked yet, right? So something that could come up. Pretty broad for you, pretty broad. I haven't used a theme word, but I've got other examples at the end that you can practice with later. To what extent does Miller's use of form invite the responder to challenge human motivations and behavior? See the key words in there? Motivations and behavior. So remember, when you have a draft essay, make sure you do have a question for it, okay? People like to do generic ones, generic with no question, but there's no direction in the essay. It's better to have a question, have a direction, and then you can practice remolding to new questions. So usually there's no more than 3 key terms in a question, okay? Just keep that in mind. If there's a really long question with an extract or whatnot, there's still only 2 or 3 key terms in the question. You have to figure out what's the essence of the question. Don't start thinking that every term is key, okay? So you read the whole question a couple of times. Make sure you don't misunderstand what it wants you to do generally, but when it comes time to actually incorporate the question into your essay, you really just are focusing on 2 to 3 key terms and elaborating on those and relating those to what you already had. Don't use them in conjunction with one another. What do you think a lot of people will do for this essay? What do you think they'll write next to each other a lot? What 2 words will appear next to each other in the essay, which is not good. Now in your essays, if you got this, are you ever going to have the 2 words next to each other? You're definitely not, because what you want to do is you want to separate those terms and consider a relationship between them. So if you get 2 key terms like that, you relate them together in some way. And typically how they relate together will be based on what you already had in the introduction in your draft. So there'll be some kind of relationship there. You're just going to make that work, right? Or you're going to rephrase it. So obviously motivations and behavior are different things. And if the question gives you 2 theme words like love and community, you also don't ever put them together. You define each of them separately and try and find one way that they link to each other. Cool. So in terms of the essay structure, here's the general structure for you. I structure it in this way that I do conflict. I establish the problem at the beginning. I then go into what's the struggle, and then I talk about whether there was a resolution and why that's important. See how logical that structure is? What's the problem? What's the response of the individual, proctor, and is there a resolution? The conflict struggle resolution is an all-encompassing structure which will be adaptable to any question, and then you can talk about motivations and behaviors in each of the paragraphs. So you shouldn't split it up into rubric terms, and you also shouldn't really split it up into themes that don't make sense as to why they're progressing from one to the next. Like there should be a clear order and a reason for that order to your ideas. What is the problem with the world of Salem? Okay, what's the problem? If you can answer that in the topic sentence in somewhat specific terms, that's a good topic sentence. For your second body paragraph, how does the individual, John Proctor, respond? And is that response easy? What's the struggle? What is his struggle? What's one of the key emotions we talked about why Proctor struggles? There's a tension there. There's a tension between facing the public because he knows that's what he should do because he is a man of integrity, right? But also confronting that dent to his integrity from the past, right? There's that guilt of betraying Elizabeth. So he carries that guilt. But obviously, one of the essences of the play is that you can be paralyzed by guilt, and that can actually be catastrophic. Like, you should move on from guilt. He hasn't dealt with his guilt. He's trying to deal with it in a very private and suppressed way, but he hasn't fully accepted it and let go. Can you all see that? Proctor never lets go of the guilt, and then that actually causes this delay. And then therefore he has to pay the ultimate price, but he ultimately does come into ownership of his actions and is willing to face the public because he knew that if he goes to court, he's probably going to have to admit of his affair. He thought that might come out. Because it's easy to be a hermit, isn't it? Like you just stay in your little shell. I never have to face any of these things that could come out from the public, right? It's like today with social media and stuff. Like the more you put out there, what do you see about celebrities and stuff? What are they constantly facing? Hate, public scrutiny, but also what do you see with politicians and whatnot? What constantly pops up? So anyone who gets involved in public affairs, people dig to make a story on them. So they'll dig and they'll find your past. So the more public you become, the more you are susceptible to public scrutiny, which is why he's avoiding that because he feels guilty. You see? So that's the struggle that he faces. The other struggle he faces on an external level. So do you see that internal aspect of the struggle? So this is the second body. If you're thinking about how to order your ideas, I'm going through that right now. So there's an internal struggle, but there's also an external struggle. What's he struggling against? Why is it so hard to convince people of the irrationality of this hysteria? They're all conforming, and then who's the institution who ultimately he's answerable to? Like, who is the key institution who he has to face? It's the church initially, but it's actually more the court in the sense of like later in the play, it's all set in the courtroom. It's the courtroom and then the jail in the last 2 acts, okay? So in the courtroom, he's actually facing judges who are clearly manipulating the presumption of innocence. You should all write that down. The presumption of innocence is inverted, but yet they assume you're guilty. That's why anyone who gets pointed at for being a witch is just automatically guilty, unless you confess and turn someone else in and continue the lie. Are you all seeing the thread of ideas, how it all keeps coming back to these central ideas? Okay, so do you see how there's an internal and external aspect to that struggle? Then when we move to resolution, I've got a prompting question there for you to help you order that argument. To what extent is integrity rewarded? Well, you talk about how he has to privilege is a nice word. He has to privilege his integrity, right? Above what? The temptation to conform.